Fighting games saw great success in arcades and later were ports on home consoles, with some titles being added on Sega's 8-bit systems, which for many would seem an impossible feat, but are visibly on display in much detail, with some playing way better than you would think. If you are interested in learning more about the history of Sega's unique 8-bit console, then stick around, as here we will be reviewing and ranking every fighting game released on the Sega Master System. Mortal Kombat 3 was released in the arcade and on consoles in 1995 to mass appeal, following the massive success of its predecessors, with the game also finding home on 8-bit consoles such as the Sega Master System, being released through Tectoy in Brazil, as the console was still very popular in that region. However, this game is very different from its two previous games released on the system, as yes, it is impressive that developers managed to have these games running on the console in the first place, but Mortal Kombat 3 did have certain features removed with the combo system, as the limitations of the hardware wasn't able to work or cope with such a high level of detail and animation needed to use them. The fatalities themselves are also impossible to pull off, as there is also little info on the Master System button inputs to execute them, plus the game does suffer from terrible lag, taking longer to pull off moves after pressing buttons, leaving it feel very sluggish compared to other versions. Coupled with the poor and choppy frame rates and animations doesn't really help the game in the long run. There are also fewer characters and levels available than would have been seen on 16-bit versions with the Mega Drive and SNES. Although with all these gripes, it still is impressive to see the game running on the Master System, but out of the 3 games released, I would have to see this as being the worst of the 3 games, as the overall quality just seems to be lacking compared to the 2 previous games seen. Jang Pong 2 is an interesting game, as it is an unlicensed off-the-cuff version of Street Fighter 2, often otherwise known as Street Blaster, that only saw a release in Japan for the Master System. It is almost apparent from the beginning that this is somewhat of a Street Fighter knockoff, as the character names are different, and even the scenes you fight in are completely different from what would be seen in the original game. With that being said, there are different versions of this game that are out there, that all play the same, but they do have some subtle differences regarding level backgrounds, designs, but essentially they are all the same. It does have some decent visuals, with the character models and level scenes that look impressive, but don't look as good as the version of Street Fighter 2 that officially got a release through Tectoy in 1997, which we will cover later in the video, and you will be able to drastically see the differences. The main issue with the game is the sluggish animations, as everything looks choppy and doesn't have the fluency of its official counterpart. Still, it's an interesting version worth trying. Pit Fighter is an arcade game from 1990 that would later be ported to both the Sega Mega Drive and Master System, both in 1991 and 1992, that saw you fight in an underground fighting tournament. choosing from 3 character types, all with their own distinctive combat abilities, from a champion kickboxer, a karate black belt and a wrestler. The game will see you fight across a total of 11 stages, with every third stage being a bonus fight, fending off against a carbon copy version of your chosen character that would allow you to earn cash bonuses upon winning. But the main goal is to fight your way to the final level to face off against the masked warrior to win the tournament. Each fight requires you to utilise your combat and special moves, along with making use of weapons and throwable objects to acquire power-ups to deal damage to your opponents. This is a tough game to get through, as opponents are tricky to beat, just as using standard punches or kicks alone are not enough, instead forcing you to spam moves like jump kicks to deal damage while evading enemy attacks, which can become repetitive quite quickly. Plus, it doesn't help that after each subsequent fight, after you win, your health bar doesn't replenish, so you have to utilise a strategy in order to try and win, which will more often result in you losing the life, so that you can replenish your health bar to start all over again so that you have a better chance of winning. I owned this game myself growing up, and I will admit it definitely took a while to get familiar with it, but with some patience and luck, eventually you will be able to beat it. For the sake of not repeating myself, each of the 3 games mentioned here are virtually identical, bar a few visual tweaks, but little else, with the original game originally releasing in Japan and Europe in 1987 under the name of Heavyweight Champ, with it being rebranded in North America under the name of James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing. The game would also later be re-released in Europe and Brazil under George Foreman's KO Boxing, again with only minor visual tweaks, with one of the main differences seeing George Foreman sitting and eating burgers during round intervals. But gameplay wise, each game is the exact same, but it is very difficult, as they are almost impossible to win fights due to poor hit detection and collisions, with opponents being able to deal way more damage on you with simple punches, making it more difficult to win overall. On the plus side, the visuals are decent, but if we compare that to the Rocky boxing game that was also released on the Master System, for me personally, that is by far a better boxing experience. Pro Wrestling is a fun early fighting game released between 1986 and 1987 on the Master System, picking from a selection of teams to fight your way through a variety of different regional tournaments with the aim of becoming champion. The game also presents a multiplayer mode to either go head to head or play cooperatively with friends to progress through matches, pulling off many iconic moves from drop kicks to neck breakers, clotheslines and power slams as you bounce your opponents off the ropes. That will also take you out of the ring to pick up chairs to use as weapons against your opponents, but you must watch as the timer counts down. Pro Wrestling has some simple yet colourful graphics with decent controller settings that are surprisingly easier to pick up and play than what you would think, although many would state that the game can quickly become repetitive after a while, but it is still fun to play in short intervals. But if you are a fan of old school wrestling games, then there's no harm in really giving this one a try. Mortal Kombat on the Sega Master System by comparison is much weaker when compared to its 16-bit rivals on the Sega Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, but still, it is interesting to see this, as with all other games on the system, that isn't all that bad to play, although it is way better than the later Mortal Kombat 3 sequel, which would later release in Brazil. The controls and movesets, animations, while sluggish and choppy, do work much better than the later sequel, although you will find at times yourself resorting to spamming certain moves to achieve victory. That is until you face off against Raiden, which is arguably one of the toughest of the original characters to fight against in the game, as it will come down to luck and patience in order to win. I played this version through a friend having the Master System version growing up, and it was enjoyable to a degree, more so playing with friends, but I often still see this as a wonder to see that the game is even running on the console, and to achieve what it did. It is impressive in that sense alone. When Mortal Kombat 2 released a year later on the Master System, there were some minor tweaks added to the visuals, but the gameplay would still suffer from the slow frame rates and choppy animations, along with the sluggish controls seen in the first game. Although with timing and luck, most of the movesets from other versions work in the same way, pretty much with Scorpion's spear and Sub-Zero's freeze abilities, working well to slow down and deal damage to opponents. But as like all versions of Mortal Kombat 2, the game becomes unbearingly difficult, even on easier settings, to progress, seeing AI opponents constantly block and spam moves, leaving little room for strategy just to accept defeat. There are only 2 stages where you can fight within the game, along with all characters having only one fatality finisher, which considering the controls will be almost impossible to pull off for many. Still, this is often considered as the best version in the series, that is better than the original game, marginally, but is way better than the later Mortal Kombat 3, which we have also covered previously at the beginning of the video. WWF WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge, released on the Sega Master System, Game Gear and NES between 1992 and 1993, allowing you to play through a roster of popular wrestlers from The Undertaker, Bret Hart, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair and Shawn Michaels, among others, through normal matches or steel cage events, with your goal to beat up your opponents and achieve victory. In normal matches you have to pin opponents to win, whereas with the cage matches you simply must climb to the top in order to win. While that may seem easy at first, it is also one of the most difficult elements to achieve, as you must correctly position yourself in the corner of the cage, tapping buttons on the controller to climb while making sure that you have no interference from your opponent. In normal matches you can also jump out of the ring very easily, but you must watch the timer, as getting close to the count of 10 will almost guarantee victory for the other fighter. The game has seen a re-release in recent years under the WWE branded license, but would change up some of the characters within the game to choose. But funnily enough, the game controls and movesets are much easier to use and implement than you might think, and the matches themselves can be over super fast, well, for AI fighters at least anyway. But honestly, I found this game to be a lot of fun in short bursts. It is limited for what it offers, but overall it's not a bad game to play either solo or with your friends, and if you're a fan of wrestling, I would definitely give this one a try. Rocky released for the Sega Master System in 1987, and from what we have seen previously is among the few boxing games seen on the system with Heavyweight Champ being re-released under different brand names, but all being essentially the same game. But Rocky plays differently with better animations, combat, movesets and overall visual appeal, plus the matches themselves, especially in the beginning, are more balanced, as you can actually win matches through skill and determination instead of sheer luck, as with other games. But the game itself does become increasingly difficult as you progress, facing off against familiar opponents seen in the movies. But during each stage you are presented with a series of mini-games, acting as training sequences that require you to achieve a set number of hits or punches in order to win, which will further aid in future fights. Overall, I find Rocky to be a very solid game on the system, and it is easily, for me, the best boxing game that you can find, and it is definitely one of the best fighters on this list, without a doubt. The 8-bit version of Street Fighter II was released in Brazil for the Master System in 1997, as the console was still highly popular in that region, being developed and released by Tectoy. There are differences regarding visual details and features to allow the game to run on the system, but honestly it still looks very impressive, considering the limitations witnessed, especially on the character models. But two characters are missing from this version, with Dalsim and E Honda. But the game does play well with fast-paced but slightly choppy combat animations, but can be more difficult to pull off special moves compared to other versions seen on the Sega Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. There is an unlicensed version of the game that would release for the system in Japan under the name of Jang Pong, which we have covered previously, that looks similar but doesn't have the same visual detail or appeal compared to this version. But it also suffers from poor choppy animations and slow frame rates that could make it unplayable for some. But aside from that, there isn't an overall large selection of fighting games on the Master System itself, so this version of Street Fighter II I would consider to be easily one of the greatest fighters seen on the console.
Fight! Fight!
Virtua Fighter Animation is a very interesting 2D fighting adaptation of the legendary franchise from Sega, being added to both the Game Gear in 1996 and later in 1997 on the Master System in Brazil. This game would have its own distinctive story, and like in the 3D iterations, you must defeat opponents by beating the hell out of them while using various combat moves at your disposal through each character, and you also have the ability to win fights by knocking fighters out of the arena. While visually the game doesn't have the same level of detail if we compare it to other games like Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat or even Rocky, but I would have to consider this game to have the best combat and fighting mechanics of any game seen on the Master System. It is a very well put together and solid game with a great mix of fighting animations and special moves that can be used to win fights. It does present a challenge later on, but the fights against opponents are more balanced, allowing you to change out your fighting strategies as you play. Overall, this is a very solid experience, and I definitely recommend that you try it. Masters of Kombat was released on the Master System in 1993, and from the get-go, this has to be arguably, in my opinion, one of the best fighters, if not the best, seen on the console. You play from a selection of 4 characters competing in a tournament to understand the events behind an alien ship landing on Earth, behind a series of bizarre events. The game presents some solid visuals and very responsive combat controls, being among the best of any fighter seen on the Master System, with fast-paced and frantic gameplay. Each of the characters have their own distinctive movesets and abilities, which present very challenging experiences overall. The game has also become one of the most expensive titles ever for collectors over the years seen on the system, with prices hitting double or even triple digits just to gain access to a copy, as it is so rare to find. But seriously, between Masters of Kombat, Virtua Fighter Animation and Street Fighter 2, it was a tough call to decide on what I would consider to be the greatest fighter on the Sega Master System in general, as they all bring interesting highlights to each experience. But really, they are all solid titles that I recommend that you try, without a doubt. There are definitely some interesting games on this list that, while lacking in many areas when compared to icons of the 16-bit generation, are still impressive just to see these games on the Sega Master System, although some of them simply could have been better, in my own personal opinion. But they still do appeal to some, and will be more so to avid collectors. But this is just a small portion of the many games released on the system and beyond that are worth looking into, which this next video will provide, as we will dive behind the scenes to view more of these interesting titles from Sega's classic catalogue.